There's one in November and then one in December.
Yep. So yeah, there's a fourth assignment, a shorter paper. Yeah, I'm just going to cover it. Although, of the students that are here, assignment 4 is due the 27th, which of course is when you get back from Thanksgiving break. The 23rd is the last day of classes next week. Just in general, how do you all feel about extending the deadline out to December 4th to give you the week after? Sounds good to me. I mean, the 23rd is the last day of classes, so we'll at least be here on Monday. Yeah, we'll be here Monday and Wednesday. What that? Yeah. Yeah. So vacation begins at 6 p.m. on Wednesday. So, yeah. Let me put it this way: I'll be here. The lecture will be recorded as usual. All right, but I did want to introduce your last big assignment. There is a final, but it shouldn't be that big of a deal. And this time I will publish the correct version ahead of time. The actual big capstone assignment for this course is the term paper. And so you now have, as of today, like 4.5 weeks to complete it. What it's going to be is a 5 to 10 page paper on, well, I mean, you can do your own topic, but what we're looking for as far as the term paper goes is a cybersecurity problem that specifically does not necessarily have a technical solution. So we can't implement a technical control in order to cover it. One of those things where we have to deal with people. And I'm not looking for you to give really an answer to the problem. If it were that simple, obviously we wouldn't be writing about it. But at least to explore the topic, talk about, an overview of the problem. You can talk about potential solutions and how they may exacerbate other, comorbid problems along with it. So things like home automation, IoT, and how they relate to privacy, for example. We could implement technical controls to protect privacy, but that would then exacerbate additional problems. Home automation, IoT devices, they rely on networks of networks in order to even function. So we couldn't implement privacy measures without reducing functionality. It's kind of part of the technology. We've talked a couple of times about feature piracy, the right to repair, the right to modify, and so on. That's a pretty rife area to deal with these days. There's lots of material out there. That one should be one of the easier topics if you're looking for one of those. And of course, we could develop technical controls. There's DRM, digital rights management technology, that we can implement to prevent people, but is that the right thing to do? There's an ethical quandary there as well. One that is, I'm going to say the trap that a lot of students fall into is topic number 3 there when it comes to robocalls and phishing. I noticed that a lot of students who pick that topic tend to pick it because they assume it will be easier. But it's one of those things that you just kind of fall into a trap with it. If it were a solvable problem, it would have been solved. So if you pick that one, you go right ahead. But the real problem is, as I tried to give a hint here, how do you distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate traffic? All communications look the same at the end of the day. If you participate in any of those robocall security features that a lot of carriers are offering these days, as I do. You might notice that you're missing a good number of legitimate phone calls, if you even get phone calls anymore, because there's no way to tell, right? And everything is kind of blocked by default. Let's see, topic number 4 there, security encryption versus security inspection of all communications. So sometimes even cybersecurity is at odds with itself, just as it is with everything else. And so, of course, we want things to be encrypted. That's important to maintain confidentiality, but monitoring is also important for security purposes. And when everything on the end, very soon, just plain port 80 HTTP is going to be deprecated. There's already major browsers, Chrome and Firefox, discussing the possibility in future versions not too far along the horizon of simply disallowing it by default. The only reason they haven't pulled the trigger yet is because they don't, well, long story short, the PKI infrastructure is kind of a house of cards. And so there's some question as to, whether or not that's going to be workable in the future. But as soon as something like that, let's say a house of cards that at least Google controls fully, then that day is not too far away. And we can answer that problem individually at organizations with what are known as full proxy firewalls. So essentially, encrypted communications terminate at perimeter security appliances, decrypt, inspect, re-encrypt, fend off, and then it's proxying every web request as it comes in and out. But that too leads to additional problems like network bottlenecks and so on. And then on top of that, of course, there's privacy concerns. Now, and of course, again, being at odds with ourselves, there's even competing interests within our own society on this matter. So, for example, the certain regulatory agencies, such as the FCC, and of course, 3-letter agencies like the NSA, they don't want things to be encrypted. It makes their jobs harder. And so from even a societal perspective, there is privacy maintained by encryption against, national security interests. So that's something that could be explored. And as we touched on a couple of times, the last topic, maybe you could select content moderation, law enforcement, and governance on the internet. That one's kind of a rabbit hole. So if you do choose that topic, limit yourself, limit your scope. Choose maybe a single site or a type of site, whether it's social media or like Wikipedia or something like that. How does Wikipedia maintain the veracity required of a repository of all human knowledge, kind of a thing? And then that will greatly assist you in not getting into the point of you have 10 pages and you've just finished explaining these sites and how they work. So also, if you want to do your own topic, go ahead. You can run it past me if you're not sure if it's exactly what we're looking for, but as long as it seems to fit the bill, I'm probably not going to say no to it. So whatever you'd like to do. Just make sure it relates to cybersecurity and one that we can't just, like, the answer to your paper can't just be, okay, well, intrusion prevention systems. Right? It's an easy answer to certain things. 5 to 10 pages. The rest of these are just guidelines as usual, so don't worry about it too much. All right. Okay, so today we are talking about big data, and we're also talking about information and big data ethics. All right, so obviously the first question is what is big data? And if you've gotten this far into a 300 level class in your academic career, you've probably heard it a couple of times. So I'm not going to go into detail on this because we're going to be looking at it specifically from the perspective of cyber-sociological. But in a nutshell, what we've had, in addition to a computing revolution, Moore's law dictating that essentially computing resources double every, was it 2 years or so, I think, when it was first coined. And then after that, we find that with digital storage systems, it's more like every year and a half or so. So digital storage, our ability to at least hold information for archival purposes for a seemingly, well, not necessarily indefinite amount of time, because, for example, DVDs and Blu-rays and CDRs and so on were never actually intended to be true archival media. If you've got any of your old important data, if you've still got your saves from The Sims 2 or something on a CDR, you should know that there is a shelf life on those. They don't last forever. They only actually last a couple of years or so. But in terms of our ability to store information, even outpacing the astronomical growth rate of other computing resources, such as our ability to process said information and so on. And quickly, the invention of digital storage, overtaking what was traditional analog storage and magnetic media, to the point where now just about all information that we have is going to reside in a digital format to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of exabytes of information. However, big data, the term big data, does not apply to data storage or data sets that are just big, right? And the name may imply that, but that's not actually the case. So what we're talking about with big data is, yes, we're talking about a lot of data. We're talking about terabytes, petabytes, exabytes, and so on. But what we're actually talking about, what the term refers to, is actually data which requires a fundamental shift in the way that data is handled and processed. We're talking about a paradigm shift in data warehousing and processing that moves against what had been up until big data, the conventional way of doing so, which is known as structured data. Most organizations still deal with structured data, and if you've taken a course with Professor Dollinger, I'm sure you've heard all about that. But that's not, big data is that paradigm shift. It's a switch from structured data to unstructured data, because the amount of data that's out there, of course, has exploded over the last couple of years, but the way that we use and consume data has changed, because originally database systems and data warehousing systems essentially sought to replicate what had been the primary consumption of data up to that point, including back to pre-archival media to paper records, which was a lot of business data, spreadsheets and databases, customer information, and so on, inventory systems, all of that structured data. Pretty much anything that you could put into a category of rows and columns could be considered structured data. But most of the data that we deal with today, outside of that traditional paradigm, of course, is what's known as unstructured data. So data that does not necessarily fit easy into those database type paradigms. We're talking about web pages, relationship data, other types of metadata, images, videos, and so on. Basically everything that we see out on the internet most of the time would be considered unstructured data. Now, structured data, database systems are meant to essentially take data which is otherwise useless and put it into a format where it can be searched and processed for business purposes. It makes the data useful. Well, big data as a term refers to the processing of unstructured data in a way to make it useful. And the question is exactly what use do we possibly get out of it? Primarily, not to be confused, the purpose of the big data, as it is these days, is advertising, right? Just as most other things are. At least, asterisk on that. That is to say that that is how most of us directly experience it, but that is actually not the primary use of big data these days. All right, so when we're talking about vertical scaling of big data, we're essentially talking about, so again, Moore's law is that eponymous law that essentially said that computing resources will exponentially increase over a fixed amount of time, which actually turned out to be something of an underestimation of the human race and our ability to innovate in terms of computing up to a certain point. Because what we actually saw with Moore's law is that there was an exponential increase in computing power, and then suddenly in the 2000s, early 2000s, we saw, no, sorry, in the 90s, we actually saw that it was not a fixed rate, that there was a sudden jump in our ability to innovate in terms of computing power to the mid 2000s, to where we saw an exponential slowdown in our ability to process our ability to innovate in terms of computing resources, simply because we reached a point where the physical limitations of our reality made it, at least with current technologies, impractical to comply with Moore's law, putting us now on the cusp of either the next great innovation in our ability to work within the physical limitations of our reality, or to experiment with a different set of physics entirely. That said, when it comes to data warehousing, the physical capabilities for us to hold data does not adhere to the same as we have with, for example, processors or anything like that. It turns out that our ability to innovate in different areas isn't necessarily all tied to each other. And so our ability to store information outpaced Moore's law at first, and actually continues to do so as we go, because we innovate individually, right, when things aren't necessarily connected to each other. So the idea of vertical scaling is to try and make the best possible use out of computing resources. And again, unconventional uses of those resources eventually do give rise as well, just as, well, I guess the very presence of computers in our lives was sort of an unintended consequence of innovation in that regard. As it turns out, originally what was business machines, as they were originally called, I mean, now all of us have them, and most of us don't use them for business purposes. But vertical scaling implies the increasing system parameters of processing speed, storage, and memory for greater performance, trying to get more out of existing resources. Horizontal scale was the innovation that led really to big data, because vertical scaling works well with structured data. If we have more and more data to put into fewer and fewer resources, obviously that's the way to go. But with horizontal scaling, what we're talking about is more distributed systems. So being able to store information in multiple different places. You could say that big data is a result of necessity, first of all, and primarily, because when you're dealing with structured data, you must have central repositories of said data, and then you offer redundancy in order to provide availability and integrity to those systems. But with big data, since it's unstructured data, distributed systems are not only possible, but actually desirable, and give rise to what we experience today as modern cloud computing systems. And that is what allowed for the big data revolution, because the internet essentially allowed every node connected to it to store certain amounts of data, and they could be processed separately, of course, in various different locations with distributed computing models. Now, I'm sure you've heard this before. Again, if you've had a course with Professor Dollinger or even Professor Flughaut, if you've had DAC 101, you may have covered this. I honestly have no idea. But typically, the term big data refers to certain characteristics of the data with which it holds, I should say. And there's actually, because it's such a new topic, both to our society and in terms of technology, it's in a state of flux. And the number of V's that you'll hear about depends a lot on who's talking about the subject. Typically, what you see are 3 or 4, volume, variety, velocity, and sometimes veracity. So volume, yeah, big data is big. We're talking about large data sets here. We're talking about petabytes or exabytes of data, obviously, but that's not all that goes into what makes big data big. Variety refers to the repositories, the sources of that data. Where does it come from? As a matter of fact, one of the metadata tags that accompanies all big data data sets is going to be something that's known as provenance, essentially the origin of the data, which speaks to partly its domain and type of data. So is this geotag information like EXIF data from images posted to Instagram? Is this demographic information, age, birth date, favorite color, and so on from Facebook and all that? That variety of data gives partly the ability to extrapolate even more information out of these large data sets. So variety is important to add context and breadth to data points. Velocity, the rate of flow. So how fast is the information coming in and what is its timeliness? And then veracity, how reliable can the data possibly be? So certain information, even though it's part of a large data set, is generally unreliable. We've mentioned a couple of times the concept of a shadow statistic. All criminological statistics, all justice statistics for that matter are all shadow statistics, as are many statistics in social science. So if we were to have a huge database of, let's say, criminal justice information, the number of people that accepted a plea deal versus those that went to trial and the outcome of those trials, all of those, that's a big data set, and we could research that and maybe extrapolate some important information out of that. Except we have to understand that as a shadow statistic, all we're really understanding is the crime, which was, in the case of this example, which was actually somebody was arrested, somebody was arraigned, charged, went to trial, and either plead out or went to trial, right? And so we have to understand that that only tells us a limited amount of information. Sometimes you hear about a couple of other V's as well. For example, variability, which is how statistics change over time. Certain amounts of certain pieces of information, rather, are likely to change more often than others. For example, if you were to have let's say that you are doing work with Netflix, right? And you're looking at a data set and you're trying to figure out what should the next big Netflix original be. And then you're getting ready to green light some scripts that come in. And based on the data that you have, you green light yourself season 3, Tiger King, or is there already 3 seasons? Doesn't matter, don't answer. And then it turns out, well, you're looking at your data set. It's from 2020, and because of the variability in people's favorite shows, their watching patterns, well, that information is no longer timely, and you're not really seeing people's current favorites. You're seeing something from a couple of years ago. There's a lot of variability there that makes it less reliable. And then also sometimes there's even a 6th V called value, because of course data markets are markets. This is Adam Smith's invisible hand, fingers us all in real life. It does finger virtual assets as well, and that includes data markets as well. Information does have value. It's used all the time in different places, and we'll talk about some of those places in just a moment here. But to conceptualize these V's for you, or at least as many as I was able to find, these fancy infographics, when we're talking about volume, again, we're talking about, we are talking about big data. It's not a misnomer. We are talking about hundreds and hundreds of terabytes of data all the time. As a matter of fact, YouTube itself, occasionally during any change to Google AdSense typically, or any internal changes to YouTube's algorithm or something, you'll see lots of videos up there decrying, or like when they made that recent change to the way that they handled copyright strikes, which admittedly is unfair to content creators. I'm not going to argue against it, but so often you see videos of creators that simply don't have any idea into how large social media platforms and the algorithms that govern them work. And they'll decry, well, if a person reviewed this, they would see that it was fair use. And true. And wouldn't it be great if every single man, woman, and child on the planet got a job at YouTube reviewing people's videos whenever there was a video, when there was a dispute like this? Because of course, that's exactly what it would take. The amount of data that YouTube takes in every day is astronomical. It literally is impossible to have the manpower to manually review everything that comes in. And that actually is part of the problem that that old real life Iron Man Elon Musk recently had. I don't like to harp on it. I feel like I've been talking about it a lot lately, but I mean you've been watching the news. It's kind of not going great. The whole blue check mark thing, predictably kind of blew up in his face a little bit. Eli Lilly, of course, you don't mess with big pharma. They lost a bunch of money as a result. Although, of course, stock bro fanboys pointing out that that's not necessarily the case. It might have just been a normal market correction. Point is that all of this is a house of cards. We're talking about data on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, everywhere, all of these social media sites with these hundreds of users, the really big names that make up what most people experience as the ClearNet. It's an amount of information that even having the entire world as a labor force would be impossible to accurately judge. Because we're talking about lots of data. The scale is impossible to understand or to comprehend. The amount of information that each of us generates, even us, even Luddites, right? Those who generally don't participate in social media and so on, the amount of data that we generate on a daily basis is incredible. And there's lots of people that are interested in that. Even just being a subscriber, if you have a mobile phone, and most people these days do, you're producing tons of data. That data is being collected. Companies generate a lot of data, and so they participate in data markets. They sell that data, they operationalize it, and they profit off of the data that they're collecting. It's just part of doing business in 2020. Variety. The switch from structured data to unstructured data is not an insignificant amount. That revolution that gave rise to big data is important because we're not just talking about now regular old databases, things that fit in rows and columns. We're talking about Facebook posts, images, tweets, YouTube videos, and so on. 4 billion plus hours of video are watched on YouTube each month. 400 million tweets are sent per day by about 200 million monthly active users. The number of people in the United States, our entire population, again, regardless of age, gender, or creed, is just over 300 million. So that's many, many tweets. We couldn't possibly go through all of them in a year. Maybe instead of jury duty, we should serve as content moderators on social media sites. Velocity. So streaming data is obviously a thing too. Structured data doesn't have to worry about that. Structured data, your Oracle databases, your SQL databases, they generally can keep track of changes through what are known as transaction databases, meaning that you can have real-time alteration of data or multiple concurrent users altering data at the same time without really any danger of collision or corruption. But all of that happens essentially during bookkeeping periods on the back end. So when you alter, for example, an Oracle database, users will make those changes over the course of a certain period of time, but all of that later is reconciled after transaction databases are actually processed. You can't do that with streaming data. And the amount of streaming data that we are looking at is increasing exponentially as, again, IoT devices become a major thing. In order for example, self-driving cars, which is certainly a technology we're going to see, I mean, maybe, probably in my lifetime, most likely, yours, that requires hundreds of sensors and communication between autonomous vehicles and that has to be real-time communication. The quality of service there has to be top-notch because if it's not, then it's probably not going to be a technology that's going to stick around for a while. To say nothing of the other sensors that are in non-autonomous cars. I've never been like a new car kind of guy, particularly since I like to work on my own stuff. And it's just much cheaper and much easier to do that with, a car that's a couple decades old. You can go to a junkyard and you can get parts if you want to. But I do know people who have purchased newer cars, and it's amazing the amount of technology and how it's changed in automobiles just over the last 20 years or so. My car has, those tire pressure sensors, which I got rid of, but I've never had a car before that was able to do that. Let's see. Oh yeah, and some of the people I know that have new cars, sometimes they'll ask me when they have a problem. It's like I've had a couple of people have something weird happen to their car because their car has multiple modes, and like they'll accidentally put it in demo mode, which of course I'm familiar with like televisions and stuff. I wasn't even aware that cars could have demo modes until somebody accidentally put their car in demo mode, and then it wouldn't drive above like 5 miles an hour or something like that. And then there's a loading mode for the safety of getting it on and off the truck and stuff like that. Anyway, it's amazing. The point is cars have a lot of sensors these days. Even non-autonomous cars have tons of sensors for tire pressure, fuel level, oil, O2 sensors, and all that kind of stuff. None of that's new, but the way that we're handling that data, of course, the processing that goes inside cars has changed quite a bit. To say nothing of other streaming data, for example, all the network connections that are out there, the stock market, all of that's real-time data, medical information, which was structured data previously, now switching over to a more unstructured model because in addition to cars having sensors on them, the healthcare industry is in a state of flux where now people are getting sensors put in them. Some of that information has even been used in court cases, as we've talked about before, where people's pacemakers stream via IoT. Well, IoT is just a buzzword. Medical devices, people wearing pacemakers or even temporarily wearing medical devices externally. There's going to be a control unit that will be sent home with you. Sometimes you carry it around, sometimes you don't need to. You wear the device throughout the day. And then when you enter within proximity of that device, transfers the information to that device for temporary storage, and then sends it off wirelessly, because you very rarely have to plug them in, to your medical provider, who can read in real time your medical data, or at least semi-real time in some of those cases. So velocity of data is changing as well. The veracity of information, which of course, we rely on the veracity of information in order to accurately extrapolate features from it in order to understand the significance of certain data. But so reliant have we become on certain systems that rely on these data feeds that it's gotten to a point where if data has a low veracity or a low low confidence, not confidentiality, a low confidence, a low probability of accuracy in these cases, that it can actually lead to downtime or mistakes or other issues. We actually rely on a lot of these systems without even really realizing it. There are three major industries, private industries, that rely on big data all the time in order to provide services. And well, I guess we'll talk about the consequences of veracity or lack of veracity when we get to that point. All right. One V that is, of course, never part of this equation, because as is so often the case, cybersecurity often an afterthought, security, privacy in general, often an afterthought in emerging technologies. Vulnerability, never mentioned, but that's obviously a major concern here as well. Because all of this, despite the buzzwords, and I use buzzwords all the time because you kind of have to, but ultimately, what is the significance of a term like machine learning, or even terms that actually mean something like AI or big data or something like that? Is that you're often just using them as shorthand, but people use them for shorthand, not understanding exactly how things work in reality. And big data is still just data. We're still talking about data warehouses. We're still talking about technology and people working together to achieve certain ends, which means that you have hardware and software to be concerned with. Anyone here ever used Hadoop before? Yeah? Hadoop? Yeah, that's my next question. That's like your most likely exposure is going to be within that. Well, Hadoop is a software package. It's not immune to vulnerabilities, just like anything else is. But it's one of those things. It's arcane knowledge, arcane in the sense of it's secretive, and you really only find out about this stuff if you dip your toes into the practice of data analytics. And Hadoop, a software package, is also a programming framework. If you've ever used, RStudio or something like that, even though it's based largely on Python syntax, it's its own kind of animal. So you have, those concerns there. But all of the V's that we just talked about with the big data, all of them come with their own drawbacks and potential vulnerabilities. Variety is great, but in cybersecurity, we spend a great deal of time sanitizing data sets to prevent unauthorized disclosure of personally identifiable information, which typically works just fine. And much to the chagrin of many medical professionals and administrators that I've worked with, HIPAA, the act itself, HIPAA, dictates that data repositories of protected health information are only sanitized if an expert in data sanitization, i.e. a cybersecurity professional, verifies that that is the case. But the problem is that as the medical field moves from structured to unstructured data and takes more advantage of modern data processing and analytical techniques, the process of certifying something as being sanitized begins to diminish in its capabilities, because with variety, you're bringing in more data points, which can be correlated, which previously or otherwise sanitized data sets are no longer sanitized. So for example, if we have protected health information and we sanitize that data set by simply using format preserving encryption on the first and last name columns, that structured data, that's fine. You can no longer identify attributes in the rows with other attributes in other columns. So that's fine. But then let's say that that data is sold to a third party, and that third party is also collecting information from other businesses in the area. And then they are sanitizing their structured data in a different fashion. Maybe they're just doing last name or something like that. Point is, you aggregate enough sources of information together, you're able to correlate that all together, and all of a sudden it's no longer sanitized, it's no longer secured. Volume is a problem as well, because the more data we're dealing with, the harder it is to do these verifications, to even run the process of sanitizing data sets. There's more data there, which means it's also the same problem as variety. There's just more data points to correlate. And so on, right? So we just have a host of security issues that go along with the use of big data. But again, this is not specifically about that. All right, so let's get to the actual people in the big data system. So typically, when we're talking about big data, the players in the game are known as information brokers or data brokers, and the FTC governs those and defines them as companies that collect information, including personal information about consumers, from a wide variety of sources for the purpose of reselling such information to their customers for various purposes, including verifying an individual's identity. You may not have realized it. As I said, most of us experience big data in terms of targeted advertisements and such, but there's a lot of uses that you're not familiar with, and that's a big one right there. If you get hired somewhere, or you volunteer somewhere, a lot of the times these days as well, there's a lot of businesses that make their money off of doing background checks. If you graduate and put on your CV that you graduated from this university, and then you apply somewhere and they actually want to verify that you graduated, again, they go to an information broker to do so. It's the National Clearinghouse is the name of the broker that handles that information, among others, but National Clearinghouse, I think, is the biggest one. Differentiating records. So all of those data mistakes that we often have to deal with structured data, users having similar attributes, mistaken identities, misattributed data entry, and so on and so forth. Somebody goes through all of that, except in this case, we're talking about a lot more data, so that's times 1,000. Marketing products, of course, as I said, targeted advertisements is how we generally are experiencing these things. And preventing financial fraud. If you have a bank account with a debit card, occasionally you may find yourself suddenly having issues with your card being accepted at merchants, and then maybe you get yourself a phone call a half hour later and you're asked to verify whether or not certain transactions were real. Why do you get those calls? Well, because financial institutions are making use of big data to essentially profile your shopping habits, and if you do something that's slightly out of the ordinary, or in my case, you do the same thing every single week, and they still flag it, well, that's why. They're trying to prevent financial fraud. And if you say, can we please turn this off? Say, no, we cannot. So that's how the FTC sees it anyway. Those are all of the ways that big data is used. Those are the ways, again, that the FTC defines information brokers. And this is actually a very limited view. It's a broader view than we as consumers typically have, because we generally don't see the background checks. We don't really see the information correction, actually the industry itself regulating, or the preventing financial fraud so much. At least we don't generally associate those with information brokers. But even this is a terribly myopic view, very narrow view of information brokers and exactly what they do. So keep that in mind. What we're talking about is not just people who have information. We're talking an entire industry. Information brokers is an entire industry. We're talking about people who store information, who resell information, who hold on to these repositories, who traffic in those repositories, information specialists, data analysts, people who sell tool sets to go along with them, so on and so forth. It's an entire industry. There's hundreds of thousands of people dedicated to keeping the industry running, including consultants, freelance librarians, as they are known, freelance librarians, the sovereign citizens of the big data world, and information specialists. All of those could be considered information brokers. All right, so now the industries, the private industries that are primarily making use of big data in this day and age are telecommunications, financial services, and healthcare. And you, as consumers, participate in all of these to one degree or another, probably without even really being aware that they are the primary consumers in the private sector of big data. But telecommunications companies are really big on using big data because it allows them to do things like plan future infrastructure changes. It also allows them to do things like ensure that they have available bandwidth during certain peak hours. How do they know what peak hours are? How do they know how much bandwidth to throttle per user? Big data. They're collecting a lot of it and they're crunching those numbers. That's how they figure it out. Financial services do the same thing. And when the switch from structured to unstructured data, they still use a lot of structured data. Obviously, financial institutions, it's kind of their bread and butter. But financial services, well, of course, the stock market, they always want to take advantage of the latest and greatest thing in order to pick winners, buy and sell at the right time. But also things like, for example, loan application processing. Right? Previously, what was done with risk analysis by professionals, well, semi-professionals, I guess, it used to be that your loan would be approved or denied based largely on whether or not a certain loan agent, like the cut of your jib or the color of your tie or something like that. These days, a lot of those decisions are being outsourced to big data algorithms, trying to determine exactly how risky it is to loan money to you. And healthcare is actually a big field as well. As I just said, a lot of healthcare decisions. Not necessarily, I mean, we are in healthcare, we are talking about insurance for the same exact reasons as the financial services sector. Insurance companies, of course, are real big on big data because it helps them to more easily pin down whether or not you're an insurable human being. But also, when it comes to healthcare decisions, again, previously, differential diagnosis for certain symptoms came down to whether or not your doctor was creative enough to think of alternate solutions. And these days, a lot of those decisions are being left up to huge data sets that are essentially providing doctors with some insight into other potential problems based upon prevailing trends within the healthcare industry and a patient set that extends across however long, nationwide, statewide, worldwide, could be anything. And all of this is well and good. You know, this is the good side of big data. This is us making use. Again, you know, when Prometheus gave us fire, sure, it gave us warmth and it gave us light, but it also has a downside because it hurts and it can be used to burn things down. But this is the good part. This is the stuff that we want to use, right? Because the availability of these vast data resources carries a lot of potential. There is a promise. Because it's also not right from any kind of a sense for a person to be denied, for example, a loan based upon the opinion of one person. right? Because we know what that leads to. Just look at the history of loan services in the United States. There tends to be a bias introduced to the process. One would say even necessitating a bias, right? Because it's a person's opinion. So being able to outsource that could theoretically eliminate such biases. Unfortunately, we find that data sets aren't necessarily as sanitary as we would like them to be, and often big data in its application reflects instead of the biases of specific individuals, prevailing societal biases. So they're still there, you know. There is a future technologist utopia. They call it governance by algorithm, you know, where at some far off date, a master computer makes all these decisions for us in a way that is perfectly utilitarian in an ethical sense. But we're not quite there yet. But there is a promise there. There is something there. We just went through a pandemic. Is it possible that we could use healthcare data to maybe do it right next time? Lucky number 3. I mean, there's been more than 3, of course. But is it possible that we can take this information, we can actually use it to intervene, to counteract what we saw in 1918 and 2019, 2020, with the lack of available, reliable information, right? Even those with no vested interest in a specific message weren't able to effectively communicate because there's a fog of war that goes over these particular problems. You simply don't know everything. And it's impossible to extrapolate and predict the future when you don't have enough information to do so. So could we use something like this as an early detection system, a way to gather more information, to do early intervention strategies to prevent worldwide pandemics? The answer seems to be yes, but we're not quite there yet, obviously. Can we use this in the sciences to predict materials that have yet to be synthesized? Can we theoretically come up with new materials? The answer again is definitely possibly. It seems promising. And can we use big data as a way to affect better cybersecurity for our entire society, not necessarily just for principals? Well, we are using some big data analytical techniques already in some of our cybersecurity applications and our appliances. So the answer there seems to be yes as well. Now the problem is, as with all emerging technologies, is, well, just as we saw with electricity and then the internet after that, as we talked about earlier this semester, Clark's law, any sufficiently advanced form of technology is indistinguishable from magic. And all we have in all of those cases, at this point anyway, is largely just a promise. Or as Granny used to say, you know, wish in one hand. Well, anyway, the point is that we won't know until we get there. There's potential, but getting there is part of the problem. And if history has taught us anything, there's likely to be many, many mistakes that we make along the way and many, many problems to solve before we can get there. Like, for example, we can't make the mistake, as we did with everything else heretofore, of assuming that big data as a concept is going to be the magic bullet that solves all of our problems. It's simply not. It can't be. What essential characteristics do we need to look for in maintaining and protecting big data environments? It's a bad idea to have all of this data available and misused potentially. Do we have the current level of scientific, technological, philosophical, all of that stuff? Do we have the current advancement necessary to handle this responsibly and to use it appropriately? So with this context, of course, these are not questions that I'm asking. These are questions that people way smarter than me came up with long ago. But to help answer those questions, Back in 2012, the White House announced the Big Data Research and Development Initiative. The idea was to try and answer these questions and also to accelerate the pace of discovery in areas of big data, to make it possible to collect this information, process it, extract knowledge and insights from all of this data going on. Essentially to get that data converted into information, try and convert it into knowledge so that we could somehow use it to better society. Now, something happened also in the years preceding this, 2012. There's a reason that the White House was interested and wanted to get involved. And the reason for that is because, I mean, I don't know if you experienced this firsthand yourselves, but the early 1990s to the early 2010s was a major shift, not just because the internet was becoming a thing and social media was becoming a thing, but in terms of American society at the time, there was actually a huge change. The number of people entering the middle class, for example, an unparalleled era of prosperity, essentially. Part of that, of course, brought about from decisions and so on, politically and socially up until the time. But the technical revolution, the technological revolution is really what inspired a lot of that. Partly because of how in the United States we define things like poverty, for example, but part of it also due to policies like, well, for example, the Obama phones, right? The much maligned Obama phones actually had a huge impact on the lower class here in America. Suddenly having access to a cell phone, which at the time of the program first being started was still somewhat considered to be a luxury item, but a luxury item which had a major impact on the day-to-day lives of people who otherwise didn't have access to that technology. It was more than just having a phone. Suddenly had access to the same technology and the same information that everyone else had had access to up to that point. Broadband internet is rolling out. Everyone's got mobile devices. So it was a huge time of change. Now, that was great for a lot of people, but what experts, data scientists at the time noted and passed on to the White House is that because more people than ever had access to this technology, the amount of unstructured data that was being generated by Americans on a daily basis was also exploding. And so there was an opportunity, they said, to essentially get on the gravy train early and start building out these systems, which, because of that, spoiler alert, we definitely made use of those. You might not have heard about it, but we definitely made use of those. But this also had a catch-22 kind of situation, because while the technical revolution up to the 2010s had been closing that gap between the poorest and the richest in terms of their access to technology anyway, and that was a good thing. But then this move to unstructured data and big data revolution that followed afterwards meant that that gap had widened once again, right? We got everyone caught up with the day's technology, and then technology went off in a completely different branch, and all of a sudden, oops, we have data disparity once again. All right, so this brings us to a distinction, and we haven't covered this just yet. We are running out of time for today, but I guess we'll see how far we get. So there is ethical considerations here. We've obviously tap danced around a little bit to this point, but there is a difference between information ethics and data ethics, because data ethics, what we're talking about here in the use of big data repositories, is not typically a concern for the average person. Usually what we're talking about when we're talking about big data ethics or data ethics in general is we're usually talking about the players in the game, the data brokers, the corporations, and governments. And it's usually more about concepts of right or wrong in the consumption and storage of data, whereas information ethics is typically what you have been empowered with, or you have heard about at a number of different times, or what you are trained on as an employee a lot of the time as well, which deals, of course, with professional conduct, intellectual property, access to technology, and that kind of thing. But since we haven't had a chance to cover information ethics yet, we'll do that first. Because we have touched on a couple of topics related to information ethics before. Like, for example, a little while ago, we talked about net neutrality, talked about Lessig's framework, and about how market forces tend to be the most influential on businesses online. Well, of course, the seed of the net neutrality argument we also talked about when we talked about obscenity is the desire to censor content out on the internet as well. But we haven't really discussed the ethical imperatives behind censorship, because in our day and age, of course, there are, well, let's just say that we're kind of at a crossroads. And this isn't the first time we've been here. In the 70s and 80s, anyone here a fan of the Dead Kennedys? Okay. The Dead Kennedys was a punk band, really popular in the 80s, from out west in California. They have a couple of songs where they specifically name drop certain politicians of the time. And they, like the majority of edgy artists, recording artists back in the 80s and 90s, a lot of their work maligned what would be considered today, according to, again, political traditions change. For example, the whole red versus blue thing, you might not even know that that wasn't a thing before 2000. It was the 2000 election that established the Dems are blue and the Republicans are red thing. Anyway, so prior to that, by today's political traditions, they would be considered to be liberal politicians. California Uber Alice is one of their most popular songs, where they specifically name drop then governor of California, Jerry Brown. And Jerry Brown, Tipper Gore, many other politicians of the day, all of them associated with what would now be considered liberal or democratic political traditions. They on the side at this point of censorship, concerned about precious children and dead Kennedys manipulating their minds and converting them to Satanism and stuff like that. Whereas today, when we think about censorship, usually we're thinking about, book burning parties and stuff, and banning certain topics from classrooms across the United States. And sometimes, yes, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago with public shaming and cancel culture, and Andrew Tate and so on. Sometimes censorship these days is also still associated with the political traditions of the left when it comes to deplatforming people or banning them off of social media and so on and so forth. This is stuff you hear in the news. I'm not making any kind of a judgment one way or another on any of this. I'm just repeating nonsense at this point. But the point is that censorship is an issue, and we are at a crossroads here, because from an ethical perspective, there are arguments to be made both for and against. Is censorship ethical to do? Is it in the best interest of society to do so? Because yes, some people believe that there are certainly arguments to be made both for and against. And when we're talking about content on the internet, we're talking about all of that unstructured data that goes out there. We're also talking about, structured data to an extent too, but usually it's art that is censored. So is it ethical or not ethical? Well, the argument for censorship being ethical is that there is, in our society, an ethical duty, an imperative, as it may be considered, to protect minds from messages that might be influential, that might influence people to maladaptive, antisocial, or self-destructive behavior, particularly those where it comes, where it's related to sexism or racism or some other sort of discriminatory speech. And specifically, when it comes to presenting that information in public, right? The idea is that it's not about necessarily preventing negative opinions or negative material from being consumed, but it's more about promoting a positive ethical standard, right? And I don't necessarily ascribe to that. I personally, and this is just my personal opinion, tend to ascribe more to a rule utilitarianism when it comes to my ethical framework. But we can't say but there's nothing to that. Because we live in an era where there are no gods, no masters, no heroes. We just don't have that many role models that actually do. There's no evocative, positive ethical framework, really. There's no one really to look up to anymore. And we have to say that that does work, because when I read this, what it reminds me of is the rise of the KKK. So following Reconstruction, heading into early 20th century, we're talking 1910 to the 1920s, the KKK is rising up in the South, right? In a response to the Civil War, of course, Reconstruction, politically a disaster, for a variety of reasons, which we won't go into because I just don't have time to. But groups of disaffected individuals, right, whose pride had been hurt, started to band together. And just as we see with the apparent rise of fascism today becoming a real problem. And there's a couple of ways that you can combat that kind of thing. For example, you can stamp it out, right? You can hunt them down, you can throw them in jail. You can deplatform them. You can, anywhere you see material related to them being posted, you just get rid of it, right? And that keeps their numbers low because no one knows where to go and so on. But how effective is that really? I don't think we need to follow this, at least, okay, in my opinion, I don't think we need to follow this idea to its logical conclusion to realize that what we're actually doing in that case is just creating an undercurrent, right? A counterculture movement, one that would remain secretive. We've talked about deviant subcultures here already. So how were they combated? Because although they're, again, rising today, there was a point at which the KKK was all but stamped out in the United States. And did they do it by censoring them? No, no, actually what they did is they used Superman. So Superman at the time, of course, this is the era of radio, right? And there wasn't a lot of options out there. Who likes to listen to radio back then? Well, it's the same people who are interested in watching a lot of TV these days. It's going to be typically kids, but of course adults are interested in that as well. And with so few programs out there, one of the most popular, particularly down in the South, was the Superman radio show. So what did they do? Well, they made the KKK Superman's nemesis. They did a little bit more than that. They actually contacted people who were recruited into the KKK and had them divulge, for example, like that week's secret code words and stuff for their meetings. And they would actually use them in the radio shows so that KKK members knew that they had a mole on the inside. But over time and over the course of only a couple of years, right? These kids, they weren't looking up to the KKK anymore. They were looking up to Superman. KKK were the bad guys. Enrollment dropped off. People didn't want to be associated with the KKK. They're the guys who Superman beats up. They're the bad guys. They had a positive ethical role model. Superman, for God's sakes. Can't do better than that. Literally invincible. But we don't have that so much these days, do we? We don't have heroes. We don't have role models. So maybe the next best thing is censorship. Maybe it is the only thing that we can really offer. I tend, again, personally, and just purely personally, to be more of a utilitarian in my ethos, my ethical framework here. And I tend to believe the words of British philosopher John Stuart Mill, who essentially argues that it is actually immoral, it is unethical to censor material. Not all material. Sure, I don't think that it's necessarily a good idea for 8-year-olds, for example, to listen to anything that comes out of my mouth. But that doesn't mean that I should not, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't have a platform somewhere, because information is actualization. It is agency. You cannot have knowledge without information. And censorship restricts information. I don't necessarily believe necessarily in the marketplace of ideas, which is to say that if an idea is bad, that people will reject it. I don't think any of us are that naive anymore in 2022. But overall, censorship is a harm, right? In my opinion, anyway. Because again, John Stuart Mill, it is morally wrong because unless you know the extent of knowledge available in the world, you can never truly understand the world itself and can never actually make your own informed decisions. You don't have information to do so. And also, as Mill says, that censorship is indeed an immoral concept. It essentially infantilizes people. It regulates morality. Because if you draw the line somewhere, and I agree that a line must be drawn, but wherever we draw that line, whatever arbitrary distinction we make, we are essentially making a distinction between those who are allowed to know things and those who aren't. And then along those lines also, what is allowed to be known and what is not, which is a topic that is easily abused. As we see, censorship advocates occasionally will use it to do things like remove information about evolution in libraries and curriculums. And it creates what's known as a false dichotomy. It's another logical fallacy here, because of course, those who sit in the middle on this issue and say, okay, well, if the answer is a little censorship, then maybe what we can do is simply present multiple sides. We can advocate against censorship and we can restrict information by just including multiple sources of information. But this assumes that all ideas stand equal. And when those ideas are evolution or creationism, and the subject at hand here is, let's say, an 8th grader or something like that, well, presenting those two choices as equal isn't necessarily true. So, what is the best thing for society? What is the ethical solution here? Well, if you have the answer, please let somebody know, because it's an important question. But where I personally sit on this, and I guess this is what I'll leave you with for today, is that, at least in my opinion, again, as Mill says, it's probably better to err on the side of giving people too much information about the world. Understanding, at least giving people a fighting chance to understand anyway, the mess that we're all in, right? All right, so we will continue with this next time, talk about piracy and big data. See you.